Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be breaking down and ranking who I think the 10 best teams in the NBA are. Quick disclaimer, this video was recorded a couple weeks ago, and the only reason I mention that is because for every team I say what their current record is. Those were obviously different then than they are now. Also, this is not a power ranking of who I think the 10 best teams in the NBA are currently. This is a season-long prediction of who I think the 10 best teams will be throughout the year and when it is all said and done. I also have these teams separated into 4 different tiers as there is some drop-off throughout the list. And this is going to be part 1 of a 3-part series covering the list in the interest of each video not being 30-35 minutes long. So today we are going to be covering teams 10 through 8, and those are the teams in the 4th tier. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy, and I really hope these takes age well. So, as I mentioned, I have these top 10 teams separated into 4 separate tiers, and the first tier we're going to be going over are teams 10 through 8, and they are in the not quite tier. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. These are teams that I think are going to be very, very good, obviously, but not quite good enough to be certainly not finals contenders and probably not conference finals contenders. But the first team I have on that list, and the team that I think will be the 10th best team in the NBA this year, are the Oklahoma City Thunder. Last year they had a record of 40-42, so I anticipate them taking a pretty big leap this year. They currently have a record of 2-0, and they're coming off a big win against Cleveland. Their most important offseason move was drafting Cason Wallace, who's a 6'3" guard out of Kentucky. He's a really interesting prospect. He averaged 12 points, 4 rebounds, and 4 assists per game last year. He had an effective field goal percentage of 52% last year and an overall field goal percentage of 45%. So he's a pretty solid shooter. But the thing that excites me most and the thing that I think gives him really high upside are his physical tools. He's 200 pounds, he's a 6'8" wingspan, and a 36-inch vertical leap. And the thing that really jumped out to me when watching the tape was his strength as a player. Strength is a physical tool that I think maybe flies a little under the radar, goes a little underrated in basketball, especially when we're evaluating prospects going from the college level to the NBA level. Strength, high-level strength, really allows a player to do 2 things that can really separate them from some other guys at their position, their peers, so to speak. It allows you to get to your spots so much easier on the offensive end, and it allows you to knock players off their spots when you're guarding them. So every basketball player has certain spots on the offensive end that they're most comfortable scoring the ball from. And when you have high level strength, upper body and lower body, it makes it much easier to get to those spots, create contact, draw fouls, and to get off shots easier. And the inverse is true on the defensive end. When you have high level strength and you're stronger than the guy that you're guarding, you can knock him off his spots a lot easier, and it makes it much harder for that guy to score on you. And this guy has a lot of strength, and that's going to be something that I'm going to watch a lot all year, and I hope it develops. I hope his physical tools develop as well as I think they could. And I think he's going to be a very good player, most likely. Nothing crazy, but a good piece for them to have. And that leads me into what their biggest strength is as a team, and that is their ridiculous amount of young talent. Their top 6 guys in terms of assets, I should say, and these are probably their top 6 best players, are Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Josh Giddey, Lou Dort, Jalen Williams, Cason Wallace, and Chet Holmgren. That is a ridiculous young core. And that's one of the reasons I think they're going to be so good this year, is because they just have so many good basketball players. And in the regular season, when you have that many good basketball players, it's going to be hard for a lot of teams to match up with you flatly. And they weren't as good as I think they probably should have been last year, and that's because they didn't have Chet Holmgren, and that's because they weren't as experienced as they are going to be this year, and they just weren't as good. They have another year of experience under their belt growing as a team, and I think that's going to be a massive development for them. Their biggest weakness was not making the playoffs last year, which really hurt them. I think it's something that kind of went a little under the radar because the Thunder are the young up-and-coming team that most people are talking about. But They missed the playoffs last year, which robbed them of gaining valuable playoff experience, which could have helped them a ton this year. If they had made the playoffs last year and got some experience, if SGA had come into this year with a little more experience, if Lou Dort had come into this year with a little more experience, I think that they probably would be 2-3 spots higher on my list. Playoff experience is something that's so vital for young developing teams to have under their belt. I think they will gain it this year, and that brings me to what is a successful season for them? What would mean success at the end of the year? Just a good, hard-fought playoff series. And I know that sounds like I'm undercutting them a little bit given how good I think they're going to be, but it's hard to win in this league, and with this group of guys, they haven't made the playoffs, really. They haven't made a playoff run yet, and they're going to have to gain that experience this year, and hopefully they'll get into the tournament. They probably will, and when they do, I just expect them to play well and show some grit, show some toughness, and that will indicate future progress for this team. But I think this team's great. I think this team has a very bright future, and I see them being the 10th best team in the NBA this year. Moving on, my number 9 team, I have the Sacramento Kings. Last year they had a record of 48-34, and their current record is 1-1. Their most important offseason move was re-signing Harrison Barnes, retaining that vital piece to their core. Their biggest strength as a team is, as far as I can tell, just retaining pretty much all their core pieces from last year. Obviously Murray, Fox, Sabonis, Barnes, Herter, those core group of guys, Davion Mitchell, all those guys I think are growing really well together, developing really well together, and it's important that they kept them all together. I think that was the right move. We saw them, there was rumors that they might try to get Draymond Green. I thought that fit was pretty good, but it never seemed realistic, and it never happened. Obviously he re-signed. But yeah, their biggest strength is they retained all their core pieces, and they have a great offense. Last year, they were the league's best offense. They had a rating of 119.4, and they averaged 120.7 points per game last year, which was 3 points higher than the Celtics, who were the number 2 team. Their biggest weakness is, though, they're not a good defensive team, and they were the 24th ranked team last year, and this is something that we saw just last night in the Warriors game come to fruition. It's hard for them to get stops down the line of games against really good teams like the Warriors, who have really good half-court offensive shot creators. Steph Curry, Steph Curry is going to dice everyone up, but Steph Curry and Chris Paul methodically picked them apart last night and put the game away. And it looked like for a second there that the Kings could have made some sort of run and maybe made some noise and come back. But for a lot of that game, if you were watching it, Chris Paul was doing his classic high pick and roll, getting into his mid-range. And when you had him and Steph Curry against a poor defensive team, you're going to lose that game. And that's what happened. They lost that game. So that's something that they really need to improve on, I think. What would success mean at the end of the year for the Sacramento Kings? Winning a round of the playoffs. The Kings and the Thunder are very different teams. They're very similar teams. In my opinion, they are both young, developing teams who need to use these couple years where they're not really serious contenders. They need to gain as much playoff experience as they can. Playoff experience, as I mentioned with the Thunder, is so valuable, and the Kings gained a lot of it last year. I thought they were going to win that series against Golden State. In Game 7, Steph Curry had probably the best game of his career, and they ended up losing, which no shame in that. That was a great step. But this year, you need to take the next step, and that's winning a round or two in the playoffs. And then if you do that and you keep developing your guys, who knows, maybe in a year or 2 or 3, you could be a legitimate conference contender, depending on how well the development of, De'Aaron Fox goes. Can he really ascend to a top 10 player in the league? Because that's what you're going to need if you want to be a legitimate conference contender, especially in the West. I really like the Kings, though. I think they have a great coach. I think they have a good group of players. They're not that top tier level of players, especially with their defense at the moment. But I have them as the 9th best team in the NBA. I think they will be the 9th best team in the NBA this year. Coming in at the 8th spot, I have the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cleveland is sitting at 1-1 right now after losing to the Thunder the other night. And last year they had a record of 51-31. Their most important offseason move was signing Max Strus, acquiring him from the Miami Heat, gaining a really good three-point spot-up shooter. He had an effective field goal percentage of 56% last year and a three-point percentage of 37% last year. So just a good shooter, and a weakness that they had, which was spot-up shooting and shooting overall. He fills that void. Also getting him away from Miami is good, as they are, of course, a conference rival. Their biggest strength is their defense as a whole, and more specifically, their front court defensive personnel. Evan Mobley and Jared Allen is an absolute nightmare to be able to just roll out those two guys at the power forward and center position and basically give every single front court scorer in the league besides Jokic, Giannis, and Embiid hell every single night. It's going to really affect, last year they were one of the best defensive teams in the league. They just affect people, affect offensive scorers at the center position. So that's their biggest weakness, is their defense as a whole. That's their culture. They have a great defense. Their biggest weakness is their wing depth. It goes Karis LeVert, Max Strus, Isaac Okoro, George Niang, and Amani Bates. That's a very thin lineup at the wing position, especially if Strus or LeVert goes out. You're looking at some really scary stuff if you're a Cavs fan. I'm not going to lie to you. That is clearly their biggest weakness from a roster perspective, is their wing talent and depth. And what would a successful year mean for the Cavs? A second round appearance, and a good second round series, win or loss, I think would be, you'd look at that and say, yeah, that's a really successful year, because while this team is not good enough to compete with Miami, Milwaukee, or Boston, they're a team you don't want to play in the playoffs, especially if you're one of those top three teams, given the strength of their defense and the kind of trouble that can cause you. I was really disappointed with them last year losing to the Knicks. I really thought they were going to win that series. Donovan Mitchell is such a fun player to watch, but the problem is he's not that top tier level of superstar that you need to be a conference final contender or a finals contender. And if he was, they would be. But he's not. I think the Cavs have another pretty good year, probably hover around 48, 49 wins. And, the season ends similar to as it did last year, unless Evan Mobley really starts to develop. And I'm talking like massive leaps in terms of, you could see him being your best player next year or the year after that. Unless he takes a massive leap like that, the Cavaliers are drawing dead to make the conference finals. And I have them as a very good team, not a lot of upside, and as the number 8 team in the NBA this year.